for coming. My name is Alfred Meyer. I'm with Physicians for Social Responsibility in the United States of America. And I want to thank the Baha'i international community for making this lovely space available for us. The event today is sponsored by Physicians for Social Responsibility and Human Rights Now, a Tokyo-based human rights organization. We will have 3 speakers. Mr. Anand Grover will speak first. He's the Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on the right to health in Fukushima. He will be followed by Dr. John Rachow from Physicians for Social Responsibility, who will talk in part about a review of the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation summary report, which will be presented to the General Assembly tomorrow. Physicians for Social Responsibility and the group International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the Germany chapter, did a review of this UNSCEAR report, the Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, and we have some comments about that. We all know what a tremendous catastrophe Fukushima has been, particularly for those who live closest to the damaged facility, but really the effects are worldwide. And today we hope to begin a very serious discussion about how the United Nations responds to this challenge of the Fukushima catastrophe. We have these 2 reports from the United Nations agencies, but they seem to have quite different conclusions. And we'd like to look into the characteristics of both reports and, as I say, start a very serious discussion so that the UN can respond to the very profound needs that this situation presents to us. After, the 3rd speaker will be Ms. Mari Inoue from Human Rights Now. She will talk about the human rights aspects of this circumstance. After our 3 speakers, we will ask any members of the press if they have questions for the speakers. And then we are taking written questions from the general public, which we will present to the speakers and have what I hope will be a very good discussion. So again, I thank you very much for coming, and without further ado, I present to you Mr. Anand Grover.
Thank you very much for inviting me on an issue which I think is very, very important. I'm glad that you're having this meeting. I want to thank the Physicians for Social Responsibility and Human Rights Now for taking up this issue. I just want to emphasize that mine is not a report of the United Nations. The special rapporteurs are independent rapporteurs. They don't actually, they may not even subscribe to some of the views of the UN. So the rapporteurs actually have to make their reports in the context of the human rights as they're understood generally. But even there are differences. So my report need not necessarily agree with the UNSCEAR report or the ICRP report or any other report of any international body. And that's the reason special rapporteurs are appointed, so that you have an independent view. And there are differences. So what I want to, at the outset, set out is what's the right to health approach. I'll do it summarily because I think that's where the real difference lies, and I'll try to emphasize that as we go along. So the right to health framework, which is actually the elaboration of Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, is not limited to health effects or health risks of a particular situation. It is actually dependent on a number of other fundamental rights, including, for instance, the right to information, informed consent, and right to autonomy. In human rights, the individual is at the central focus. Unlike the public health approach, the public health approach is based on cost-benefit analysis, if I may put it very crudely. And the difference is really there. And that's why there is a difference in the approaches. The right to health framework not only focuses on individuals but also vulnerable communities, particularly those who are likely to be affected by a particular risk. So the individual is at the center of it, and it casts certain obligations on the states. And the covenant, which is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, unfortunately only casts obligations on the states. Now, one of the major problems in the human rights framework is that there are no obligations directly cast on independent private non-state actors. So corporations, who are actually the, if I may use the phrase, the villains of the peace, are not accountable directly to any system internationally. They are directly accountable to domestic laws and therefore if there are judicial remedies. There are three obligations directly put on the state. The obligation to respect, so that state itself cannot interfere with the right to health. The obligation to protect, that it has to actually also make sure that non-state actors do not interfere with the right to health. And then they have the obligation to fulfill, which is they have to put in place legislative and administrative measures to make sure that the right to the health of the people is realized. But now, very importantly, the right to health framework is a progressively realizable framework, unlike the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Civil and political rights and economic and social cultural rights are seen differently by the international system, and it's not to do intrinsically with the nature of fundamental rights or human rights, but because of the what I call the political modus vivendi between, loosely termed, the capitalist societies, US, Europe, and those so-called socialist societies of the erstwhile Soviet Union, who gave primacy, as they thought, to economic, social, cultural rights, as opposed to, say, freedom of speech, etc. Now, actually, this is a modus vivendi, which is a political modus vivendi. It's not intrinsically linked to rights, and basically, it was to accommodate various political concerns. But there is, as I said, no difference, and they should be realizable. But at international law, right to health framework is progressively realizable in the sense, if you want to make sure that everybody gets basic medicines, for instance, you may not be able to do that in a country like Belize, for instance, immediately. So you may be able to do it 10 years later. So that is why it's progressively realizable because of economic constraints. But within that, there are certain core obligations. For example, if you want to make sure medicines are available to all the people in Belize, then you must have a plan today. That is an immediately realizable goal. Similarly, there are certain core obligations which are not derogable. And one of the core obligations, which I think is very important in terms of, or in the context of Fukushima, is the participation of individuals and communities. One of the things I may tell you that I found in Japan was there is a certain political and cultural paradigm where it's very difficult to articulate the notion of participation of communities. It's all done by politicians, by people in power, the corporate entities, and their legislators. So individual groups of people who are affected by any disaster, for instance, are not considered to be important enough, whose participation is not considered to be important enough. And I think that's very important as a lesson. The right to health framework, the obligation of respect is making sure that private entities, non-state actors, do not interfere with the right to health. So TEPCO, for instance, in this case, which was the Tokyo Electric Power Corporation, should not actually do things which interfere with the right to health. And that's where the Japanese government was sorely lacking in terms of the regulatory framework. Everything was done by the corporate entities, and really the Japanese government did not have an independent regulatory framework in place to see that things that are supposed to be done are done. And as you know, as far as the plant design was concerned, the way they responded to the disaster left a lot of things wanting. And I hope it's not on system. This is because I'm in a different time zone, I think. I'm so sorry. Normally when I go to court, I just switch it off. But and this is where it was lacking, so I don't want to get into that too much. Now, coming to the UNSCEAR report. UNSCEAR report, it's a summary report. I met some of the people who have written the report, and they said it's a summary report, and the criticism that you guys have actually launched in them, rightly so, is going to be apparently addressed in the next years that are going to be available, which are going to be like a huge truckload of them. But what are the basic sort of findings? Before I go into that, the real issue, without going into details, is in a case like Fukushima or Chernobyl, where there is emission of low dose ionizing radiation, is there any evidence of deleterious consequences to human health or plant health or animal health? That is a fundamental question. Now, a lot of reports that have come out from the UN system, and I think that's why you were right in actually pointing out that there is one view which is coming out of the UN system, the former UN system, and the corporates and the nuclear lobby, if I may use the word, is that in fact there's no real problem. Secondly, that Fukushima is a very old plant. It's outdated technology. And we have really got the technology in place now, which will not actually allow an accident of that type to happen. But even if it happens, then the low dose ionizing radiation, there is no evidence to show that there will be deleterious consequences. Except, and this is universally accepted, that for children there will be effects on thyroid. So thyroid cancer is a very clearly admitted position that it would actually occur amongst children. All the rest, according to that particular point of view, there's really nothing to worry about. That's the message that they have. Now, as far as I am concerned, that's actually not correct, and for the following reasons, and that's the fundamental point. What they say is that there's no evidence for any kind of possible deleterious consequences to the public at large, adults, for other types of cancers. Now, the reports that came out of Chernobyl, we know they were wanting for various reasons. So the data which was available from Chernobyl is not sufficient to show conclusively that there are possible deleterious consequences. But it is not possible to say or rule out that there won't be any deleterious consequences. That is the uncertain field, and that is very important. So if that is the case, rather than going in the public health context, which is cost benefit, and that is applied across the board, across universally to every aspect of human endeavor. You introduce new jet planes, you introduce new transportations. Are there deleterious consequences? Of course there are. Carbon dioxide emissions, etc., global warming, etc. But what are the benefits? Huge benefits. We can travel from our hotel to here in 5 minutes. Otherwise it takes us half an hour to walk. Or take an example, which would be, okay, I can meet my family every 6 months in the US or England. My family lives in England. I live in India. Because of the jet plane travel, I can meet my family every 3 months, every 6 months, depending on my capacity to go. I couldn't do that earlier. That's a benefit, one of the benefits. So if you look at the overall cost-benefit analysis, according to them, it's good. That also would be challengeable, by the way, but we're not going into the deeper issues of what human society is going to be. But the issue about even 10 people dying because of these technologies, is it acceptable or not? So what would be your paradigm? Moreover, it's certain that thyroid cancer would come in for children. It is certain that those people who have to manage the actual emissions because of the disaster, the workers who work on it. Okay? What's happening?
I'm just changing.
Don't change it, please. I'm digressing. Because the workers who are actually responsible for making sure that the emissions are stopped, the workers who are on the front line What about them? Certainly they are going to be affected. And interestingly, what I reported in my report, and I'll tell you about that, the actual way things are managed in the corporate sector, the contract workers who actually manage the whole show, out of 2,500 workers who are actually managing the radiation so that people do not suffer, can you believe that 70% of them, more than 70%, were contract workers who are no long-term contracts in terms of either payment or health safety measures, that their health would be taken care of. So this is a major issue in a country like Japan, which is highly developed compared to, say, India, where you're going to have a huge number of nuclear plants. What is the status of those people? Is it acceptable at all or not? So these are issues that are of concern. But in terms of the figures, what is the UNSCEAR report say? They say the exposure to the general public, average effective dose on the day of evacuation was only 10 millisievert, and a day after it fell down to 5. Estimated absorbed dose to thyroid was 30 million gray, and to 1-year-olds it was much larger, 70. So average effective dose in the first year to adults is very low, 4 millisieverts. 1-year-olds is only 8. So estimated lifetime effective dose for those staying in Fukushima prefecture without any remedial measures was 10 millisievert. So that's quite low according to them. There are exceptions and variations which can be accepted from people with other behaviors or people living in different areas where the actual exposure will be different. Within the district there could be different internal and internal exposures, external and internal, sorry, and you can't, they cannot be discounted because food contains a lot of radioactivity and you can't really look into that. But they do admit that infants would receive thyroid dose up to about 100 milligray. Now this is very important. What about the nuclear plant workers? They were about 25,000 nuclear plant workers. 15% of them were directly employed by TEPCO. 85% were employed by contract workers. I'll tell you a bit of a story about this. Because when I went to Japan, as a rapporteur, it's not good, it's not acceptable that you write something that you're not sure of in terms of evidence. So when I was in a meeting which Human Rights Now had organized, Kazuko and my friends, I became friends of Kazuko after Japan, by the way. And to make it clear that I do not actually subscribe to any lobbies, because there is also the other side that, oh, you are actually, promoting some NGO agenda. But in any event, I was in a meeting and they had called some of the workers who had worked in the plant. And they then met me and they told me, well, most of the workers who work in the plant are not only contract workers, but they stay in shanty towns in Tokyo. So I said, what are you talking about? I did a very famous case in India of pavement dwellers, really shanty towns. And I know how it operates. So I couldn't believe that. There was a person in Japan telling me that people living on a street in plastic sheds, just plastic, in the bitter cold in December. I just couldn't believe it. So I said, I don't agree with you. I want to see this. And I actually went to see these people, and they are literally living in plastic sheets. And they're all subcontractor workers. And they told me that people are hired by contractors of TAPCO, and they are taken there, and the moment they have actually exceeded the dose of 100 millisievert per year, they're thrown out. And there are no records kept of these workers. So they're exposed to radiation doses, and we don't know what happens to them. And actually, if you look at the report, is there any available data to see whether those people are being followed up? There are records, but whether there are actually people there who actually tally with those records is a very big question. And I asked UNSCEAR whether they had met the workers whose reports they had seen. Because you can have a report, because the reports are written by contractors, by the way, not even TAPCO. So Anand Grover worked with us, and his exposure dose was X. Was it only for that year, next year? We don't know. So these people, 85% of these, and imagine how many there are, that's about 3,000 are about 3,750 would be 15% directly employed, and the rest of them are contract workers. In a country which is highly developed like Japan, what are you doing to a set of workers who are being exposed to this radiation? What their workers told me was that we are exposed to a particular maximum limit, 100 millisievert, which is the actual absolute limit according to Japanese law. And then they're just thrown out. Are they followed up? We don't know. So in a country like Japan, if that is happening, I just shred to think, and it's terrible thought, in a country like India, what would happen? Now, they say that over 19 months, the average effective dose over 19 months was 12 millisievert, and 35% of them received a total dose of 10, but 0.7 received more than 100. 100 is the maximum dose. But average absorbed dose of 12 most affected workers who they consider are really critical was to the thyroid, which is about 2 to 12 gray. Now, assessed dose for internal exposure was, according to them, could have been underestimated by 20% because iodine, which is the main marker, iodine 133 is very short-lived. 131 is long, but it was not detected because of delay in measuring. It's only 8 days, if I remember correctly, 131. So after the number of days that they met them, they wouldn't actually see them. Now, these are the actual final conclusions. No radiation-related death or acute illness observed in workers or general public exposed to radiation. Doses for general public are low or very low. No discernible increase in incidence of radiation-related health effects on exposed people or descendants. Most important health effects, apart from thyroid cancer in children, is on mental and social well-being. So, in effect, it's a clean chit, if you look at it. I mean, everybody thinks about Fukushima as a big disaster. For UNSCEAR, it's a different ballgame. Now, implications of cancer in terms of other cancers. Now, they don't work on actuals, they work on models, the risk modeling. What they say is very interesting. They say radiation-induced cancers, it should be, are indistinguishable from cancer due to other sources. So if you do an epidemiological study, you won't be able to make out that if there's increased cancer, if at all, it is due to the Fukushima disaster. You can't make out. Of course, thyroid cancer for infants increases expected, and a number of children exposed to doses of more than 100 milligray are not known. Increased rates of nodules. Now, there was a big concern amongst parents and mothers because there was the larger nodules and cysts detected in children the first round. They put it and attribute it to very good technology basically. And they say that if you compare it to other prefectures, then there's no real concern at all. For workers, yes, those who received absorbed doses between 2 and 12 gray to the thyroid are at an increased risk. And 160 workers, now just see, this is not a small number. But if you do the cost-benefit analysis and if you're in that paradigm, you'll say, well, it's acceptable. You want technology, you want electricity, you want 24-hour electricity in your country, we need nuclear plants, that's the way to go. So 160 workers suffering, it's acceptable. That's the cost-benefit public health paradigm. Please appreciate that. Whereas the right health framework will say, no, it's your duty to see that even one worker does not actually get affected. I'm just putting it very crudely so that you understand the nature of difference. Again, very interestingly, any increased incidence will be indiscernible due to the difficulty of confirming such increase against normal statistical fluctuations. Now, this is actually begging the question, you don't know. So what do? Do you err on the side of caution, which I advocated, or you say it's acceptable because of the cost-benefit analysis? Now, they say workers exposed to doses of 100 millisievert will be regularly examined. I really have a question. If these are contract workers who are not traceable, you haven't actually tallied the records with the people who are actually affected, the workers. How are you going to follow them up? And this was the concern of the workers. This is a very important issue as far as I'm concerned. Now just see, this is important. effect of radiation exposure on children, cancers induced by ionizing radiations may occur in a few years or decades later. So you don't know, and they admit that. I mean, the report is very candid and honest, I must say. It's not that they're trying to. External and internal exposure of children tend to be higher due to their size and because the internal organs are much closer together, increasing the chance of spreading the exposure. Continued research is required, as current lifetime studies of child survivors of Chernobyl and Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain incomplete. So we don't know. The real bottom line is we don't know. But then how can you then advocate the cost-benefit paradigm? So this is the sum and substance, if I may say. There are a lot of issues that you can. It's a very small report, by the way. You should have a look at it. It's easy to understand, but the annexures are going to be quite difficult because there's going to be a huge truckload which are going to be available in some time. As opposed to that, what was my report? And there are different aspects that I'm going to deal with. Thanks to Maitri who's done the basic presentation. Okay, when Fukushima happened, what was the experience? Basically it was Chernobyl. Now on Chernobyl, the problem is there's a huge dispute going on about the implications of Chernobyl. The WHO and UNSCEAR say that whatever reports are there to mention or come to a conclusion prima facie or otherwise, that there is a chance of risk of cancers, they say that's not really conclusive. So basically they say that all the studies on Chernobyl are inconclusive, and there's a reason for it. There was a clampdown on information. Things were not available. You were living in a society which was not open. Even a society which is open like Japan, things were not available. And in that society, certainly not. But interestingly, the type of studies that Ukraine and other countries carried out after Chernobyl are much more detailed than Japan. That's very interesting. And UNSCEAR actually admitted. Interestingly, the ICRP, which is the International Committee or Commission of Radio Commission, isn't it? Is it Commission or Council?
Commission.
It's a non-governmental organization. First remember that. It advocates and lays down the standards for exposure limits. What they do is, they say in so-called peacetime, if I may use the phrase, the radiation exposure levels are X. But in a disaster situation, you can increase it. How can you do that? The safety levels are that, I was going to use an expletive, but I will refrain myself from saying it. It cannot be done. Legally, the safety levels are the same whether you are in an emergency situation or non-emergency situation. You can at the most say, this is the acceptable exposure level, and during a disaster, if it goes to this, you have X amount of time to bring it to this. You can't say I'm going to change it. So it's all hunky-dory for that time. That's not acceptable in any paradigm. And that's a major issue. And actually, privately, all the UN groups agree with me. Publicly, they cannot, for whatever reasons. Now, what is the actual exposure level in Japanese law in what we call peacetime? It's 1.3 millisievert quarterly in control zones. But the problem is, there is no causal link established between low doses of radiation and increased cancer. And that's a very big question mark. We don't know. How do you actually determine that cancers are increasing or occurring in children or adults because of radiation exposure, because of the disaster? So even small increases would actually increase risk to health, and they actually manifest years later. So because there is no discernible increase in cancer, very few people would actually really know. And for the state to take precautions is not too much of an expenditure. So my recommendation has been that you have to look at the process, because people are involved and the right of every individual to make decisions, and you must protect the right of health of the affected populations and mandate the state not to interfere with the right to health. And basically, when you don't know the long-term effects, the state has to err on the side of caution. That is the message. Now in that context, You have to do more detailed studies. You cannot go on. What the Japanese government has done is, well, Chernobyl, we know it's only thyroid cancer. That's it. The others will see. But there's no proactive effort by the Japanese government to make sure that they study other cancers. And this is I won't use the word ideal opportunity, but this is an excellent opportunity to study it. It's happened now. We can't wish it away. So why don't you do extensive studies? They haven't done that. Disaster management. The government was actually not up to the mark. They did not have strong and effective disaster management plan to contain the accident of this scale, the chaos and confusion and death that resulted. Of course, there was a tsunami resulting in the Fukushima plant having explosions, and basically it was the relationship between TEPCO and the government. Because TEPCO wanted to make sure that everything is okay, nobody knows everything about it. The government had to step in. They also started playing ball with TEPCO, and information was not released as it should have been. Significant time lag between the accident and the government revealing information. They didn't want to scare people. But actually, if you don't give the information, you scare people. The most important lesson in all disaster management is, whenever it happens, stick to the truth. We are sorry this has happened. Now this is the problem. How do we deal with it? You guys do this. And you know, everybody will tell you, Japanese people are very, what should I use the word, culturally, they accept the decisions of government. If the government says, please move from here to there, the Japanese government, understanding that society should work in harmony, they will move. So there's no reason to say, well, actually it's not this much, it's this much. You could have just done it in a better way. They had the information, they did not convey it. And most importantly, everybody in the nuclear establishment knew that to prevent thyroid cancer for children, you can get iodine prophylaxis. You know, but they just didn't do it. It was done ad hoc at the prefectural level. There was no instruction given by the national government that please start what I call prophylaxis, but they said no, that's not that's an old term. Anyway, if you want to be semantic about it, it's different. The recommendation that I make is that all management plans of disaster should be updated. There should be proper training of the persons who are likely to be affected. In Futaba, where the plant is located, everybody was told, and the Futaba mayor himself met me. He came to Geneva when the report was presented. They were told there is no problem, and they believed them. You know, ordinarily people believe what you say. They have no reason to doubt, you know, and they were not given any training or information as to what would happen if there's a disaster. Okay? Anyway, as far as iodine prophylaxis is concerned, that's a must. That's a recommendation again. What about monitoring of the potential long-term risks? Fortunately, I tell you, the government was very open, and I think they have taken a lot on board. So there's a lot of room for pushing things. They did institute a number of surveys, but unfortunately the surveys did not extend to all the areas. And most importantly, they dished out the form and told people, now you tell us what you ate 6 months earlier, that kind of thing, you know. So that's not going to actually elicit proper information. I think the government could have been much better in actually taking into confidence the people and getting their cooperation. The surveys were restricted. For example, they focused on the effect of radiation on thyroid glands of children, even though some other health anomalies have been found in the people who were exposed in Chernobyl, particularly children. Again, this we know very well. They did a survey, thyroid examination, cysts and nodules in children. Parents got worried. They wanted a second opinion. They were told you can't have a second opinion. There was a bar. There was a notification issue. You can't go to another doctor. The doctors were told, don't give the information. What are you doing? Instead of taking people into confidence, you're driving them away from you. So this is nothing to do with scientific data. It's how you manage a disaster. Stick to the truth and say you have made a mistake, and let's work together to change the situation. Every government actually, when that disaster happens, they always go into this. There's a psychological thing about human beings. I never did any wrong, you know. It's not my mistake. Well, look at ourselves. I don't blame the government. When a relationship breaks, heterosexual, homosexual. It wasn't my mistake, was it, Maitri? It was your mistake. Never admit a mistake. So, folly in human beings. But governments cannot say that we are not complicit. They're a public body. They're not in a private realm. So I think it's important. They have also, the nuclear plant workers, as I said, subcontracted workers, they have, as far as the medical checkups are concerned, what has the government done about it? TAPCO hasn't done it. Contractors haven't done it. What about the government? The government have an obligation under the Right to Health framework of making sure that the people, that the citizens' right to health is protected. And really, this is my major concern, apart from children. Very clearly it's known, what about the contract workers who have been exposed to very high dosages? Also, on the issue of radiation stations, you actually, I didn't believe it when I went there, but you could actually make out the radiation stations which are stationary, were not capturing the radiation exposure in the area. So there was a major, and that itself led to a lot of lack of confidence. I don't want to go into too much detail. In law and international law, they have a continuing obligation, that is the state, to fulfill the right to health. They have to monitor the impact of radiation on health affected persons for a long period of time and see what are the possible health effects. Appropriate treatment has to be made available. Health management surveys to persons residing in all affected areas with radiation exposure higher than 1 millisievert a year. Now, that has been a butt of the criticism as far as I am concerned. Why do you use this 1 millisievert? But that's been your norm. That's been your norm in the beginning. You've changed it. I haven't changed the goalposts. I'm going on the basic traditional norms. If you think, and 1 millisievert is not taking into account background radiation. They have tried to sort of confuse the situation. But the background radiation is more than 1. Of course it is more than 1. We are saying over and above the background radiation, which could be because of natural radiation, cosmic rays, etc. And, interestingly, but there's so much radiation because of electricity generation. There's so much radiation because people are getting their thyroid examined, they're getting their kidney examined by this and that. Well, that's part of development. Are we accepting that? There's no question on that, by the way. What about increased radiation because of certain power generation? There's no question marks on that. It's okay. But that is, man-made, not women-made right now. Mostly man-made. So can we actually get out of that? But these things are not looked into. What about the minimizing risks, negative fallouts, paying special attention to workers? I'm not going to go into that. Most importantly, when you actually have a disaster management, what about participation of people? Okay, next, resettlement policy. In terms of Japan, this is where the crucial thing happened. ICRP issued a letter after the disaster that the acceptable levels of radiation are between 1 and 20 millisieverts. Now that's post facto, and their own law is much lower now. This is contrary, as we say, to their own norm of radiation exposure to 1.3 millisievert quarterly, which is designated for controlled areas. That is where there's a there's a nuclear plant, for instance. But interestingly, in comparison, Ukraine, etc., the countries which are affected by Chernobyl, they actually had a law that the acceptable level of radiation is only 1 millisievert. But there's a lot of criticism on my report, and presumably your report also will be criticized. Why do you have this 1 millisievert a year? But that's your own norm. I haven't evolved it. I'm not a scientist on radiation law, etc. I can't really lay down any policy. So there has to be. Now what happened was, one thing that it's not completely here, they kept on changing the goalposts even in terms of the areas which should be evacuated. So people didn't know where to go, and ultimately people were forced to go even if they didn't want to go, and people who were staying inside did not know what their rights were. So there's a huge amount of litigation going on that. So you need to again have participation of people. So you need to have in advance, when you're going to have nuclear reactors like Japan has or India is going to have, you need to have these plans in advance. You have to train people. If something happens, things will be done in a particular way. Again, human rights norms should actually inform the plans and not cost benefit analysis. And then again we have to understand whether it should be 1 millisievert or another acceptable do. I don't know whether we can even think of changing it. I don't know. I'm not going to say anything about it. I will go by the norms which are already set by the international community. Now, very important, decontamination policy. So, when the radiation emission occurs, all the radiation settles on the ground, in the trees, in the forests, in the food, etc. So that is continually exposing people to radiation. So what is the decontamination policy? You take the soil and bury it under the ground, so the radiation exposure is less. Okay, you can do that, but where are you going to put a lot of that later on? We don't know. So there's been talk of, okay, we'll put it next to the Fukushima plant, but there's no clear-cut policy at all where the final sort of site is going to be of the high level of radiation contamination. Now, they had a plan which we were told unofficially that ultimately there will be a site located where all this contaminated soil or etc. will go. There's no clear-cut plan. Interestingly, playgrounds are used. People are used without proper protective gear to put the soil underneath the playgrounds, and there is no marking there. But I was told by some people, well, that's sufficient because your exposure level goes down. That's an issue. Are people informed about the rights when they're actually doing the decontamination work? In Japan, I could see people just doing it without, like self-help. Everybody does it. And there's the fervor. We're trying to do something for the nation. So everybody does it, but without protective gear. So what is the time-bound plan to reduce the radiation levels? No clear-cut plan, no site which is demarcated, no information that is available. Again, the participation of communities based on everybody doing their little bit. Okay, lastly, transparency and accountability. There is very little transparency of how nuclear plants are set up. It's going to be set up next to you. On what basis? Because probably there's the least resistance in that community. They're not informed. Like there was a huge protest in India, in Kudukalam, in south of India. They set up the plant. The people were opposed to it, but there was nothing ultimately they could do about it. It was set up, they went to court, they lost. That may be because of bad litigation strategy, but ultimately the people didn't have a say. The government had, and the government and the nuclear lobby decided. What about accountability for not adhering to government and international safety standards? Well, they didn't adhere to international safety standards, and they're not made accountable even today. Of course, they're paying on compensation. The Nuclear Regulatory Authority was not independent. That's accepted. The parliamentary committee in Japan has come out very heavily on the Nuclear Regulatory Authority, and they said that it was not independent. And that's a problem in a number of countries, because who would be the Nuclear Regulatory Authority? Suppose, and this is so-called scientific people who know the stuff about nuclear radiation. So there will be scientists. Most of the scientists are working in the private sector, and they are employed into the Nuclear Regulatory Authority. There is no demarcation as to when you can go from the private sector to the government and from the government to the private sector. You can just, there's a seamless flow in Japan. There's no sort of freezing of time that for 3 years after you work with the corporate sector, private sector, you will not work in government, or the other way around. So the two of them are sleeping very happily together, and there are no questions asked. It's a closed club. People don't have any knowledge about it, and that's the problem. That's why, one of the things all disaster people will agree with is, disaster is not because of technology. It's disasters occur because they are man-made. And they are man-made because we stop and do not think, we do not stop and think about what we are doing. We think everything is hunky-dory and we don't have to follow the norms. And one of the norms is that the regulatory authority must be independent and must check independently. And if something goes wrong, you tell them. But you can't do that, problems do come. And all warnings were being given, even prior to the Fukushima disaster, but nothing was really looked into. The scrutiny was not actually taken care of at all. Now TEPCO has been taken over by the government. See the irony of it. TEPCO has been taken over, the equity has been taken over. Government is now paying the compensation, not the private corporate entity in law. So, who's paying the money? It's the taxpayers paying money for the compensation. Who's TEPCO now? Government has taken over the equity. Now, when I mentioned this point, it's in my report, they said, but it's a private legal entity, it's a separate legal entity. That question doesn't arise. So you need an independent regulatory authority, and that's a fundamentally difficult question in a lot of societies. It's not possible to get people who can do this. Interestingly, a lot of academics who are against the government told me very categorically that we will never be invited to the regulatory authorities because government doesn't want us there. Now, in some countries, there's a tradition, including England, by the way, and in India, that if you're opposed to us, then you should be on the regulatory authority. But they will be token people. So the majority of the people would be. So you need to set up standards that if you have an independent regulatory authority, who should actually personnel it? I think that's a very important question that we should look into it. Then finally, okay, this is the last point, involvement of people. Why is it so important in disaster management, including nuclear radiation? One of the saddest things that I came across was that after the tsunami and the radiation, the Fukushima disaster, the persons with disabilities were not actually taken into confidence. They were put into houses without ramps, without all the infrastructure they require to live a life normally. And the government only realized that much later. Why? They simply did not adhere to the policy of looking and asking them, what do you need? I need a ramp. I'm an old person. I can't sit. I can't stand. Whatever it is. They just didn't ask those questions. Is it difficult to ask those questions? No. It's very important to have all these things tagged into your system beforehand. I'll give you a very simple example of a case I did of an aircraft disaster. Very famous case in India, 1982. Air India Boeing was landing. It was very heavy weather, meaning it was raining very heavily. Now, there's a protocol which is to be followed by all pilots all over the world. The pilot who flies from the left-hand side is a pilot flying. He always looks out of the window. The pilot not flying calls out the height as they are going down. And every airport has what is called a decision height. The pilot not flying will say 10,000, 5,000, 4,000, 1,000. Decision height, which is 320 in Mumbai, for instance. At that time, the pilot flying must look out of the window and see the runway. If he doesn't see the runway, or she doesn't see the runway nowadays, you have to go around. If you don't do that call outs, when the weather is fine, hunky-dory, it is not in your system. And you forget to do it. That's why disasters take place. Because you don't stick to those protocols when everything is all right. So, disasters have to be looked at from that point of view. Thank you very much.